So good evening, everybody. On behalf of the Center of Research in Emerging Economies, it gives me immense pleasure to have someone who, and I can go ahead and put it on record saying was my source of inspiration for supply chain teaching and research. I have with me Professor David Simchi-Levi from MIT, who is a stalwart in supply chain management. And it's a great honor, not only for me, for the center as a whole, to have him deliver a talk on supply chain resiliency. Before I hand it over to Professor Simchi-Levi, let me just quickly go through his bio, which which is like impressive to say the least. And I'll read out from the bio that was sent to us by him himself. And it says, Professor David Simchi-Levi is a professor of engineering systems at MIT and serves as the head of the MIT Data Science Lab. He is considered one of the premier thought leaders in supply chain management and business analytics, and I personally can vouch for that. And his PhD students have accepted faculty positions in leading academic institutes, including University of California at Berkeley, Carnegie Mellon University, Columbia, Duke, Georgia Tech, Harvard, University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, University of Michigan, Purdue, and Virginia Tech, among others. Professor Simchi-Levi is also the current editor-in-chief of Management Science, one of the two flagship journals of Informs. And he also served as the editor-in-chief of Operations Research from 2006 to 2012, which was the other flagship journal of Informs, and also for Naval Research Logistics from 2003 till 2005. He is an Informs Fellow, MSOM Distinguished Fellow, and the recipient of the 2014 Informs Daniel H. Wagner Prize for Excellence in Operations Research Practice. Also 2014 Informs Revenue Management and Pricing Section Practice Award, 2009 Informs Revenue Management and Pricing Section Prize, and 2015 Engineering Excellence Award. He was also the founder of Logic Tools, which provided software solutions and professional services for supply chain optimization. Logic Tools became part of IBM in 2009, and in 2012, he co-founded OPS Rules, an operations analytics consulting company. The company became a part of Accenture in 2016. And in 2014, he also co-founded Operalytics, a cloud analytics platform company focusing on operations and supply chain intelligence. That company became a part of Accenture Applied Intelligence in 2018. And also, the topic that he will be talking about this evening is probably one of the most pressing topics that we have: resilience in supply chain, which was evident and more evident in the face of this global pandemic of COVID-19. And of course, he will be talking about how the global pandemic has exposed serious flaws in supply chain. And also he will be talking about the need for stress tests in supply chain. So without further ado, once again, it gives me great pleasure to introducing Dr. David Simchi-Levi. And why don't I hand it over to Professor Simchi-Levi to continue this. And thank you, Dr. Simchi-Levi, and the stage is all yours.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Good evening, everybody. Good morning here in Boston. I'm going to spend some time with you talking about supply chain resiliency and the need for stress tests. Here is an outline for my talk. I will start with a brief introduction, talking about some of the things that we have observed in the last few years, as well as in the last few months. And then I will introduce a new way to think about supply chain resiliency, what we call the risk exposure model. This model was developed by MIT, by my PhD student, after event like the tsunami in Japan, where it was implemented by a variety of companies. The first implementation was at Ford Motor Company. This implementation is described in the Harvard Business Review paper. Additional insight about risk management can be found in my book, Operations Rule. Once we understand the insight from the risk exposure model, we will take it to another level by identifying the need to balance efficiency and resiliency. And then I will summarize with key takeaway. So let me start with a brief introduction. And a good way to motivate our discussion is not to talk immediately about what happened in the last few months. Rather, it's instructive to start by focusing on the last 10, maybe 15 years. In the last 10 to 15 years, companies have been extremely successful in reducing supply chain costs by using a variety of strategies. And this happens across many different industries. But at the same time that they were able to reduce costs, the same strategies that allow them to reduce costs also increase exposure to supply chain risk. What are these strategies that companies across a variety of industries have used? They include lean, outsourcing, offshoring, consolidation, extremely powerful strategies to allow companies to reduce costs. Let's take an example. If you think about lean strategies typically imply low level of inventory. Low level of inventory suggests that if there is a disruption, the supply chain will not be able to match supply with demand. Similarly, outsourcing, offshoring, consolidation, all implies that the supply chain is concentrated in a specific region. As a result, if there is a disruption in this region, again, the supply chain will not be able to match supply with demand. And we have seen the impact of these strategies on companies in a variety of industries during events like the tsunami in Japan and the flood in Thailand, as well as a volcano eruption in Iceland in 2010, disrupting companies in a variety of industries, from automotive to pharmaceutical to high tech. Of course, we have seen also examples of companies that were very successful in recovering quickly from this disruption. But if you compare this level of disruption associated with the tsunami, the flood, or the volcano disruption of 2010 and 2011 to what we see today, clearly the magnitude today is completely different. So let's take now a look at the last 8 months. Since the pandemic started hitting initially Asia, China, and then moving on to Europe and to North America. In mid-February, I wrote a paper together with a high-tech executive, Pierre Harel, that we submitted to HBR. HBR published, Harvard Business Review published the paper in February 28, and in 4 days, the paper attracted a huge amount of attention, more than 170,000 clicks in 4 days by around 150,000 unique visitors. What did we say? And remember, we wrote the paper in mid-February. What did we say that attracted such an attention? Here is the first paragraph. We say in the first paragraph, the peak of the impact of COVID-19 on global supply chain will occur in mid-March, forcing thousands of companies in Europe and in the US to either shut down or significantly reduce manufacturing and assembly activities in these countries, in the US and in Europe. And this is exactly what happened. On March 17, mid-March, Fortune reported that the European automotive industry is shutting down. They listed Volkswagen, Renault, Peugeot, Fiat, and others. MIT, my own university, picked on this news on March 25th and wrote that the previous week, meaning the week of March 17, not only European automotive industry was shutting down, but also the US automakers announced that they are shutting down. And in the MIT papers, they also said this is not just automotive, these are luxury product manufacturers. This is across industries. So you may ask yourself, how did we come up with such an accurate forecast? What I did was to use the risk exposure model that I'm going to present next to estimate when the impact of the pandemic in China is going to hit North America, it's going to hit Europe. And using this model, I estimated it to be about mid-March, and this is exactly what we saw. So let me explain and motivate the risk exposure model. And remember, the first implementation of the risk exposure model was at the Ford Motor Company. So it is intuitive to start with a simplified version of Ford's supply chain. So here is a simplified version of Ford's supply chain, starting from assembly plants. Initially, when this method, the analytics and the technology was implemented, it was implemented for the North America assembly facilities. Of course, the supply chain in the automotive industry is extremely complex with multiple tiers. For instance, in tier 1, you can see stamping plants and engine plants, then all sorts of suppliers and contract manufacturer in tier 2, and then tier 3 include chemical suppliers and the like. When I color a specific facility in blue, it means that this facility belongs to Ford. So for example, the stamping plant, which is a tier 1, is part of Ford business. But there are many suppliers, of course, that are not part of Ford business. Just to give an insight, tier 1 itself at Ford that supports the North America assembly facilities has about 5,000 suppliers. So you are talking about a very complex network. The number of parts that flow in this supply chain is about 50,000 parts. So this is definitely a complex supply chain. And the question here is, can we identify hidden risk in the supply chain? The initial insight that executive at Ford had was that risk is associated with strategic suppliers. These are the suppliers where Ford annual spend with them is very high. And so procurement at Ford, in terms of risk management, focus mostly on the strategic supplier. The question is this true? And in particular, the question is, if I have limited budget, limited resources, and I want to focus on risk management, should I focus, for example, on the engine plant, or should I focus on the chemical suppliers? How should I divide my attention between this complex network of product and facilities? To answer all these questions, I want to introduce a few concepts. The first one in our model is what I call time to recover. What is time to recover? We look at a specific facility, say the chemical supplier, and we try to identify what is the time it takes to recover for this facility to full functionality after a disruption. And of course, associated with this disruption, there is a specific scenario. This chemical supplier is telling us that given this scenario, time to recover is 2 weeks because right now they provide us with the chemical from their facility in China. If there is a disruption, they can switch capacity and move production to another facility that they have in Taiwan, and this takes about 2 weeks. And in a similar fashion, we can identify time to recover associated with other facilities, other nodes in the supply chain. Of course, many of you who have been focusing on supply chain immediately have a question in mind. The supplier, when we try to find time to recover, the supplier may be optimistic. He's not going to necessarily give us the true time to recover because they know that if they tell us the time to recover is very long, they will have a problem. So later on, I need to develop a way to validate the information that comes to us from the suppliers. But for now, let's assume that this time to recover is accurate. As I mentioned, this approach was implemented at Ford in 2013 and 2014 after the tsunami in Japan and the flood in Thailand. During the pandemic, of course, the system has been used extensively. One way that Ford used to estimate time to recover is to look at quarantine time. So, for example, Ford has suppliers in Italy. In mid-March, they estimated quarantine time for their suppliers in Italy to be about 6 weeks because of the pandemic goes in Italy, and as a result, time to recover was about 6 weeks. Once we have time to recover, we can determine what I call performance impact. Performance impact can be financial or operational. Financial may be impact of time to recover on revenue. Revenue collected by Ford. Impact can be on margin or profit. Impact can be on lost production. How do we calculate this impact? For example, suppose we want to understand the impact of the time to recover of the chemical supplier on Ford revenue. We remove this node from the supply chain for the duration of time to recover. And we ask, without this supplier for a period of 2 weeks, what is the impact on Ford revenue on the right-hand side? We can calculate this. And it's not clear that there is an impact because the pipeline may be full with inventory, but we can estimate this impact. And in fact, in this case, we estimated that the impact on revenue was about $400 million. And so we can calculate for each node in the supply chain, for each facility in the supply chain, what is the time to recover associated with the disruption? What is the performance impact associated with the disruption in that facility? So, for example, the impact of the steel bar supplier during time to recover on revenue collected by Ford is about $300 million. And this gives us what we call risk exposure, a ranking of the exposure to risk associated with each node in the supply chain, with each facility in the supply chain. So, for example, suppose we are looking at the engine plants and the chemical suppliers. Both are risky, but clearly the risk exposure associated with the chemical supplier is higher, is larger than the risk exposure associated with the engine plant. And keep in mind, we don't need to do the analysis node by node. We can, in fact, do it by region. For example, which is what happened for Ford. They may have multiple suppliers in a specific region, say a specific region in Italy. You want to remove all these suppliers for the duration of time to recover and calculate impact on revenue when these suppliers are down because of quarantine time. And in fact, this is exactly what I did to estimate the impact in mid-February, the impact of shutting down of activities in China on supply chain, manufacturing activities, assembly activities in North America and in Europe. So let's look at data from Ford to see whether the model gives us some important insight. And here is one screenshot from the system, where bubbles represent different tier 1 suppliers. The Y coordinate represent annual total spend by Ford at each supplier. You don't see values here. This is to protect confidential data by Ford, but you get a sense that, for example, this supplier is clearly a strategic supplier because Ford invests huge amount of money. The total spend by Ford at this supplier is huge. And on the X coordinate, I'm looking at performance impact. This is data straight from the system. So this is impact on profit. This is exactly lost profit associated with a disruption with a specific supplier. So if you look, for example, at this strategic supplier, right, total spend is very high. Clearly, if this supplier is disrupted, big impact on the supply chain, but it's not the largest impact. I would say on the scale of impact that we see on the X coordinate, perhaps you will refer to this as moderate impact. Here is another strategic supplier where Ford invests huge amount of money per every year. The impact, if there is a disruption, is moderate. The risky suppliers are at the bottom right-hand side. Take a look at this one where my laser pointer is. This is a relatively small supplier. It supplies Ford with sensors. Each sensor costs about 15 cents to 20 cents. But if supply is disrupted, big impact on bottom line, because if supply is disrupted, Ford has to shut down manufacturing and production line. Remember my observation about procurement executives. They were focusing on these suppliers. The analytics says, yes, these suppliers are important, but more critical to your suppliers are these small suppliers in your supply chain, which give us insight number one. The first insight is to highlight that risk in the supply chain is hidden, and you need to use data and analytics to identify where risk is and therefore design mitigation strategies. Let's look at the second insight. And to illustrate the second insight, again, I'm taking a screenshot from Ford system where bubbles, you see bubbles everywhere, represent suppliers. The size of the bubble is proportional to risk exposure imposed by this supplier on Ford. This is the performance impact that I illustrated earlier. When the risk exposure is above a certain threshold, meaning that this is considered by Ford a very high risk, I colored these suppliers in blue. So these are the risky suppliers. You can see every supplier has some risk, but these are the risky suppliers. So let's see where the risky suppliers are. These are the blue colored bubbles. They are in North America, they are in Europe, and certainly they are in Asia, but very few. This gives us the second insight. There are lots of talks in public media that you just need to move manufacturing activities from Asia to North America. This is not going to increase resiliency. Resiliency is not directly related to a specific region. You can see that you have risky suppliers in North America, risky suppliers in Europe. And so just moving manufacturing closer to market demand does not solve necessarily the problem. And I'll show you one example where we have a regional supply chain, huge impact, huge risk in this supply chain. So that's the second insight. For the third insight, I want to come back to the time to recover concept that I discussed earlier. Remember, time to recover is defined as a time for a node in the supply chain, for a facility in the supply chain to return to full functionality after a disruption. And our challenge there was when the supplier is giving us their estimate of time to recover, we are very suspicious because we are concerned that the supplier is optimistic. The supplier is not necessarily going to tell us exactly what its time to recover is, because they are worried that if time to recover is very long, Ford will be concerned with this information. To evaluate time to recover and to develop an objective way that is supplier independent to estimate risky suppliers, I want to introduce a second concept, which I called time to survive. Those of you who come from OR and optimization, you can think about time to survive as a dual of time to recover. So what is time to survive? I look at the supply chain and I look at a specific node in the supply chain. I remove this node from the supply chain and I ask, without this node, how long can I match supply with demand, right? I can calculate this without having any discussion with the supplier, right? And it's not clear the time to survive is going to be immediately zero because the pipeline is full with inventory. But the key is I can remove a node, and if I have information about my supply chain, I can estimate how long can I keep matching supply with demand, right? And so let's look at data from Ford. Again, this is straight from their supply chain. What I have here on the X coordinate, I have time to survive, right, in weeks. You can see very short time to survive, 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, and you can see very long time to survive. And on the Y coordinate, I have the number of suppliers with that time to survive. And you can see immediately a challenge and an opportunity. The challenge is on the left-hand side. These are all the suppliers whose time to survive is very short. These are the suppliers that I'm worried about. Because here we have suppliers whose time to survive is 1 day, whose time to survive is 2 days. These are the suppliers where I want to understand their time to recover, and I want to develop strategies to increase time to survive. On the right-hand side, I have the suppliers whose time to survive is very, very long. Why is it long? In many cases, it's because Ford is sitting on a huge amount of inventory of components from these suppliers. If we just cut inventory by half, we will reduce time to survive from 50, 60 weeks to maybe 30 weeks. That will be still enough if there is a disruption. As a result, Insight 3 says that those facilities with short time to survive will lead to immediate performance impact, whereas facilities whose time to survive is long provide us with saving opportunities, right? Going back to our definition, you can immediately conclude that comparing time to recover of a specific node with time to survive of the same node will give us a huge insight on how much risk is associated with a specific supplier. For example, if for a specific facility, a specific node in the supply chain, time to recover is smaller than time to survive, then supply is not going to be disrupted, even if there is a disruption at that node, because we know time to survive is very long. But if the reverse is true, meaning time to recover is greater than time to survive, then you will have to shut down facilities unless, that's why I have star, unless you have a backup plan, unless there is a mitigation strategy or plan B. And when time to recover is close to time to survive, companies will need to expedite. That is to say, suppose in the case of Ford, some of the components come from suppliers in Asia, in China, in Japan, and it takes 35 to 40 days because they ship the component over the ocean. When there is a disruption, I cannot wait 35 to 40 days. I may need to ship by air. But the model will tell you today that maybe 2 months from now, you will need to expedite. As a result, the model allowed Ford to reserve transportation capacity, logistics capacity, way before everybody else. And that's the beauty of your ability to look at time to recover, a time to survive, and identify insight like insight number 4 for each one of the facilities in the supply chain. Let me pause here and see if there are questions or comments before I continue with some more insight about what we have seen in the last 6, 7, 8 months.
Thank you, Professor. Real quick, for those of you who have any questions at this point of time, please type it on your chat box, and me or Chitra, one of either me or Chitresh will read it out to Dr. David Simchi-Levi so that he can answer your question.
So while people may be putting their question in, let me just cover a little bit of observation about creative strategies that we have seen in the last few months, and then we will take the question. So one thing that we have seen done very effectively is companies are repositioning inventory to take advantage of pooling. For example, think about PPEs like gloves and masks for hospitals. In many states, they used to be positioned at the hospitals. Now they are positioned centrally. So depending where the pandemic is in the state, the inventory is shifted to the right location. Companies are changing material, bill of material, recipes to make sure that they are able to match supply with demand. If one raw material is not available, very quickly, some of the companies that I've worked with talk about things that in the past took months for approval, now takes days for approval. Some companies not only change material, change what the production line does. Take, for example, the beer giant InBev. They start producing and distributing hand sanitizer in the US on the same production line that they used to produce beer and beverages. And of course, we talked about reserving transportation capacity soon based on the ability to identify when do you need to expedite. Okay, so let me pause here and take some of the questions if there are any.
We have the first question from someone you might know, Dr. Simchi-Levi. It's from Dr. Manmohan Singh Sodhi from City University of London. And he asks, David, shouldn't TTR also be from the viewpoint of OEM, within parentheses, Ford in this example, rather than depending on the supplier's word? The
This
OEM
is
able to switch to a secondary supplier in n number of days, and so n is TTR.
Very nice. And this is exactly what we did in the case of Ford. So say you look at a specific supplier for, I don't know, air conditioning in the car, and this supplier says, here is my time to recover, it's 6 weeks. Well, Ford identify an alternative supplier that where they can reserve capacity, and they realize, oh, we can switch very quickly. So the original supplier said 6 weeks, but in the system, we have a much shorter time to recover because of the ability of Ford to switch to another supplier. So this is really a great point that illustrates the power of this approach.
Okay, thank you, Professor. And Chitresh, you want to take the next question?
Yeah, so Professor, the next question is by one of our students, Visab Mehta. He asked that what strategy or way you should suggest to survive for the manufacturing companies who have faced competition in the market during pandemic, which was not earlier as in the case of sanitizer and mask manufacturing companies. Now, which type of changes are required in their capacity planning? So what he's asking is that there are traditional manufacturers or mask and sanitizers, and then there are new players in the market to fulfill the demand supply gap. So what is the strategy to remain in the market?
Yes, so this is a very general question, not only for sanitizers and masks. it's a general question, and it's really a good way for me to switch to my next slide to say that I focus on impact of the disruption on the supply side. The impact is not only on the supply side, it's also on the demand side. And you can see here data from, I think we collected data from about 120 different companies in different industries. Collect the data from 100 to 120 different companies about the impact of COVID-19 on demand. And as the question was, the impact on demand can come in different ways. Some companies have seen more competition. Some companies have seen a change in consumer behavior, and you can see it here on the slide. You can see in consumer product, we see some companies have seen dramatic increase in demand. In healthcare, we have seen dramatic increase in demand, but there are other industries where demand has gone down. And the key question, one of the key capabilities for all these companies is, can I predict demand better during an event like COVID-19? A different way of saying the same thing is we typically talk about visibility in the supply chain, and we talk about visibility in the supply chain, we mean upstream visibility, visibility into our suppliers, visibility into our manufacturing activities. These refer to a visibility downstream, visibility into customer demand. So we have done some work with a very large global CPG that has seen dramatic change in demand. And in this specific case, because people behavior has changed, dramatic decline in demand for their product. And the question was, can you develop a better demand forecasting, demand modeling techniques that will allow us to understand what's happening? And just to show you the challenge, this is data from one region. Just to protect the global CPG, I'm not telling you first which region it is, and I'm not telling you also specifically what are the numbers, but you can see the green represents sales in that region. And you see sales was very high before the pandemic, and then dramatic reduction, and then it starts going up. And you can see also some sort of seasonality where the demand goes up and down, goes up and down, but it's clearly different than the demand that they have seen before the pandemic. And if you look at their forecast, which is the blue line, it's completely off, right? The forecast really is different because it's based on normal time, and therefore you cannot do anything with that forecast in order to make production capacity decisions to match supply with demand. And this relates really to the questions that the previous student was asking. And to highlight this, this challenge, the red line represents the difference between sales, the green, and the baseline forecast, the blue. So we developed a model, a new model that allow us to better estimate customer demand, and therefore allow to allocate capacity differently, because we can detect which product is going to be in high demand, which product is going to be in low demand, and therefore you can allocate capacity effectively. And just to show you how accurate our forecast is, and then give you an insight how it's done, if you look at, again, the green line representing sales and the blue line representing the baseline forecast, as a new technique, change the forecast estimate to the red, and you can see we learn in about 2 weeks after the beginning of the pandemic how to adjust the forecast, and the new red line that you see here is much, much closer to the true customer demand. And the key idea in the new forecasting technique is that the baseline forecast, right, the blue line that I showed you earlier, is very important because it captures trend, it captures seasonality, but it needs to be adjusted by using additional data. And in different regions, we use different data. We use pandemic data in one region, mobility data in another region, and this is what allows us to adjust the forecast very well. If you want to read more about our method, you can look at the paper that is cited at the bottom. So let me pause again here and see if there are additional questions.
Yes, Professor. One of our colleagues, Harit Joshi, asks, while this model discusses about, and I'm reading the question in verbatim, while this model discusses about the disruption happening at the supplier end, what the current pandemic enforced lockdown has shown is that the disruption may happen at the end of the firm itself. So, how does resiliency calculated in such cases, and how is the substitutability of a supplier incorporated in this risk assessment model?
Yeah, so I'm not sure if I get the entire question. I think the question is, here in the model, I focused on disruption. In the risk exposure model, I focused on disruption on the supply side. In COVID-19, we saw disruption on the supply side, but we also saw disruption on the demand side. Is this what the question all about?
Yeah. Harit, if you are here, just type in and say if that answers your question. And meanwhile, you can go like, shall we? Can we take a couple of more questions, or do you want to move on?
But let me just address this. So the disruption on the demand side requires two steps. One is, of course, as I mentioned, better forecasting technique. But the other one, that where we apply the risk exposure model, is by analyzing scenarios where there is no disruption in the supply, there is a dramatic change in the demand, either a dramatic decline or significant increase. When there is a dramatic decline, what the model show when we applied it in certain companies, and this is what happened in practice, is that stuff is coming in, right? Because there is no disruption on the supply, but nothing is going out because the retailers are not ordering from the OEM. As a result, all of a sudden, the capacities that we have for storage of product is exceeded, and you have a problem with the products that that's still coming in. So the issue of disruption on the demand side is addressed again by the risk exposure models through different scenario analysis.
Okay, thank you, Professor. So shall we do take a couple of more questions, or do you want to move on to the next segment of your presentation?
Let's take one more question and then move to the next one.
So I have a question from Elena Vladish from Queen's University, Belfast, and she asks, would it be possible to estimate what would be an environmental impact of companies and their supply chains that manage to reduce time as well as to recover and time to survive?
Very, very nice question, actually. The short answer is yes, but it requires a much longer answer. And in order to assess impact on the environment, we need additional data that I don't have here in the model currently, right? What is the additional data? The additional data, for example, is data on carbon emission associated with different manufacturing activities, associated with different logistic and transportation activities. For example, we know that shipping by air produces way more carbon to the environment than shipping, for example, by rail or shipping over the ocean. And so this additional data can be used in the model to estimate not only impact. Remember, I'm looking at the model and trying to estimate impact on revenue, impact on margin, impact on lost production. I can use this to estimate impact on carbon emission and compare it to the baseline carbon emission level, and as a result, assess the impact on the environment. But there's no question in my mind that what we have seen in the last 8 months will serve as a very important source of data to understand the impact of on the environment, because we basically have in front of us an experimentation, right? It's a forced experimentation where companies are changing their supply chain strategies, and we measure and we collect data on the environment. To estimate this through the model, you need definitely additional data. So let me continue, and then at the end I'll take more questions. Okay. By building on the risk exposure model and trying to emphasize the need for balancing efficiency and resiliency. If you remember, I started this talk by emphasizing the success of many companies in a variety of industries to cut their costs through strategies like lean, like outsourcing, like offshoring, right? All these strategies focus on efficiency. But while these strategies have decreased cost, they increase exposure to risk. And what this section is all about is about the need to balance efficiency and resiliency. Of course, the problem is that it's not difficult to measure efficiency. It's not easy. It's not very difficult to understand and measure efficiency. But how do you measure resiliency? I'll come back to that in a few minutes. But let's start with an intuitive analysis of the trade-off between efficiency and resiliency. On this slide, on the Y coordinate, I'm focusing on efficiency from low cost to high cost. And on the X coordinate, I'm focusing on resiliency from low resiliency to high resiliency. And this line represents the trade-off between the two. For example, when the company emphasizes low cost, typically it implies low resiliency. When we emphasize high resiliency, typically it implies high cost. And a company strategy is a point along this trade-off curve. What we do when we use data, analytics, visibility, is to push the trade-off curve in a direction of improvement. Because if we can do that, then for the same resiliency, I can cut costs by moving from A to B. Or for the same cost, I can increase resiliency by moving from A to C. And you can see that there are a lot of strategies between B and C where I do better than A. What does this tell us? It tells us that it's important to correctly measure efficiency or cost by focusing here not on the cost of component, but on total landed cost. How do we measure resiliency? I gave you a number of KPIs. We measure resiliency by using concept like TTR, TTS, performance impact, to measure the resiliency of the supply chain. But in order to do that, we need, it's critical to have a good supply chain mapping of our supply chain. Put it in a different way. In order to measure the resiliency of the supply chain, we need to apply stress tests. And I published in, I believe, April, another paper in Harvard Business Review, where I said we need, or companies need, to apply stress tests in their supply chain in order to measure the level of resiliency. And I took this idea from the financial crisis. If you remember, in 2008, there was a financial crisis all over the globe. After the financial crisis, the federal government in the US, government in Europe, required banks to go to apply every year stress test in their business to identify whether or not they can recover from the next financial crisis. I believe that for national security industries, think about healthcare, think about life science, think about food, companies need to apply stress tests. And maybe like in the banking industry, in my opinion, this should be required, demanded by the federal government. What we have seen in the last 8 months also implies a need for supply chain restructuring, diversifying suppliers. It may lead to what I call global local manufacturing strategy, where some manufacturing are closer to market demand, not necessarily in North America, not necessarily in Europe, but close to them, and some are global. Uh, there are lots of talks about decoupling from China. I don't believe that this will happen. China is still one of the largest markets, but you can imagine a hybrid strategy where China for China and other manufacturing activities outside China for other region. And companies need to diversify even within China because of what we saw during the pandemic. If you had all your manufacturing facilities in Wuhan, you had to close them immediately, and you need to diversify outside China. Part of the insight from what we have seen in the last 8 months is also the need to include resiliency measure like TTR, for example, in supply contract. Now, I want to emphasize that supply chain restructuring is already happening. This is not the future. This is today. Just before the pandemic, there was a survey of about 3,000 firms that tried to assess whether companies were influenced by the China-US trade war. And indeed, a large portion of these companies reported that they either started or are planning to start soon to restructure their supply chain, and it's happening in a variety of industries. Some of them are moving to North America, some of them are moving close to North America and Europe, and some of them are moving to Southeast Asia and India. The specific strategy depends on the industry. Apparel is moving from China to other countries in Southeast Asia, to Cambodia, the Philippines, Vietnam, and the like. High-tech, we already have seen moving manufacturing to Latin America for North America, so to Brazil and Mexico to serve the North America market, and to countries like Poland to serve the European market. Life science is different because there are other challenges. I'll talk a little bit about life science in the next couple of slides. Remember, there is a lot of discussion in Europe and in North America about the need to reshore, especially in North America. The discussion, you need to be manufacturing to the US. By itself, it's not addressing the main challenge, which is resiliency. And intuition is clear, but let me show you an example that illustrates why just reshoring is not the answer. Remember, when I started, I said one of the main drivers of risk is the emphasis, the move toward consolidation of manufacturing facilities to cut costs. This happened in the food industry in the US, especially if you think about manufacturer of beef and pork, lots and lots of consolidation, very few manufacturing facilities, only in the US, but very few. Because of the pandemic, there was a shutdown of one plant. This created a huge disruption in this supply chain. It led to months of meat shortage. It crushed prices paid to the farmers. And so this was a big impact, illustrating that just reshoring is not the answer. Reshoring also, I want to emphasize, requires a lot of time government involvement. Remember my emphasis on stress test, and I am emphasizing this for national security or critical product or critical industries like life science, healthcare, and food. And in my opinion, the federal government need to establish these types of stress tests in order to make sure that when the next pandemic or other disruption are going to hit us, we are ready, especially for these types of product. But it's not going to be easy. and let's take life science, and in particular, let's take drug manufacturers. Drug manufacturers, life science companies have moved many manufacturing facilities to China and India. Part of it is to reduce cost, but this was not the only reason. One reason was that the production itself is involved in highly polluting chemicals. So environmental impact is huge. If you want to reshore this type of manufacturing activities, we need to develop clean chemical manufacturing technologies. This requires time, and this requires dramatic investment. It's not clear to me where the investment is coming from unless government are willing to do that in order to increase the resiliency of their supply chain. So a point I'm trying to make is moving manufacturing and changing supply chain structure is not going to be easy in some industries. It's easy in apparel. It's possible, and it's happening in high tech. Drug manufacturers, life science companies, this is where it's much more difficult. Let me summarize with key takeaways. There are key supply chain trends involving labor costs is increasing in developing countries. So before companies move manufacturing to developing countries to reduce costs, now with the labor cost increase, this incentive goes down. The China-US trade war is making a big impact. We see an increase in risk and impact on national security product. And what we have seen in the pandemic is economic nationalism. In some countries, they have manufacturing activities of global manufacturers, so European manufacturer or US manufacturer, but these countries did not let product flow out of their borders to make sure that they have the required product or raw material for their people. And this may be a challenge when you think about the global supply chain. And finally, I want to highlight that automation is taking off. So just focusing on low-cost strategy may be the wrong focus. As I emphasized, reshoring itself is not necessarily the solution. To identify the level of resiliency and to identify the right solution, companies need to apply stress tests. And finally, I believe in some areas, federal government needs to be involved for critical product and services and require stress testing in this case. When you get my slides, you can see references to a number of articles and talks that I gave, a couple of articles in Harvard Business Review, and a couple of webinars at Informs and other places. Let me pause here and see if there are comments or questions.
Thank you, Professor Simchi-Levi. Chitresh, do you want to take care of this round of Q&A?
Yeah, sure. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, so Professor, one of our students asked Harshvardhan Mishra that uh, due to the impact of COVID-19, essential manufacturing units like power plants and other sanitizers have changed their strategy from just-in-time to inventory increment. Okay. Now, do you see there is going to be a change in terms when we are talking about the future of production or for essential services or products of from shifting it from just in time to increasing the inventory for more resiliency?
Beautiful question. So I want to emphasize this slide. Look at this at this slide. In my opinion, we are going to see a change. But this slide is very insightful. What it says is that if you want to increase resiliency, and the level of resiliency currently is very low, then a little bit investment in your cost, in your strategy can have a big impact on resiliency. That's really what this part of the figure is saying. And here is an example. Investing in flexibility so that you can shift production from one product to another, from one business to another business, allow us to increase dramatically the level of resiliency in the supply chain without dramatic increase in cost. If your level of resiliency is very high, that increasing it requires a big investment. But for most companies, they are here on the left-hand side. As a result, I'm emphasizing small investment in resiliency, in improving your supply chain, in flexibility, achieve a big impact on the level of resiliency.
Okay, thanks a lot, Professor. Next question is by one of our colleagues, Professor Anjuman Antil. As you have already discussed about the polluting industry aspect of it, that a lot of offshoring will not happen back to Europe or America. She asked that, how do you see recycling organizations surviving in post-COVID era that are highly dependent on global supply chain for sourcing?
Yes, so I'm not an expert on recycling, so it's hard for me to say, but this is related to the problems that I just highlighted, which is the need to reduce polluting activities and the need to think about environmental issues. But I'm not an expert on recycling, so I don't want to speculate on an area that I don't know much about.
Okay. So there is another question by one of our student, Anushriya Barua, and she asked that even though companies are asking or wanting to go out of China, okay, not a lot of companies are shifting to India, but rather than they are shifting to smaller countries like Vietnam and all. What reason do you see behind such pattern?
Very, very, very good observation. So this really varies by industry. So let me make a few observations. The first is, I mentioned apparel. Apparel is moving to where labor cost is cheap. And the countries where labor cost is cheap are the smaller countries that I mentioned earlier. A lot is going to Cambodia, a lot is going to Vietnam, just because of this. Where India has an advantage is more sophisticated labor capability. And we see this especially happening in life science. That is where I believe India has a big advantage, right? Because while labor cost is not that low, you have the sophistication, you have the infrastructure, and you have significant part of companies investing in manufacturing activities in life science in India. So I think that will happen. High tech is moving much closer to market demand. Maybe there will be dual strategies for Asia that involve China and India, but I'm more thinking about the move outside China to satisfy market demand in Europe and in North America.
So what you are proposing is sectoral shift based on the skill and other.
Exactly.
Yes. Okay.
Exactly.
So there is another question by one of our student, Deepika, and she says that the consumer demand has considerably changed. A lot of things which we used to buy on a traditional physical shopping excursions, now we are buying through online portals. Now, how supply chains and operations of companies are going to tune themselves up to this new kind of consumer behavior?
Very, very good observation. So the pandemic has made dramatic shift. One of them is how customers engage with the OEM, how customers buy their product. E-commerce has increased dramatically now for many companies, but the problem is the e-commerce channel, its cost, its supply chain cost is much, much higher, right? Maybe 3 to 4 times higher than brick and mortar supply chain. And as a result, companies have to adjust their supply chain to make sure that they are able to satisfy demand for e-commerce order at a lower cost. This bring omni-channel. This bring, oh, there is an online order, but maybe I should satisfy it from the brick and mortar supply chain by moving the product to the end customer from a closed store where the product is. The point is, I don't know what the answer to that question is, but I know that this observation, that the importance of e-commerce has increased dramatically, requires companies to rethink supply chain strategies. But there is good news. And the good news is that now we have huge amount of data, we have advanced analytics, and we can use the data and analytics to automate processes. And that's probably the direction that will allow us to dramatically reduce costs back to be comparable to the brick and mortar supply chain cost.
Okay, and the next question is by Professor Manmohan Sodhi. He asked that how does the government convince any industry, especially the pharma industry, to report on standard testing? And what would standard mean in the context? What he mean by standard testing is the stress testing you have talked about.
Yeah. So first of all, it's not clear that government can force, right? On the other hand, the government, the federal government in the US establish and require part of regulation that banks will take their business through stress tests. And what is done in the financial market is the government provides scenarios, and the banks simulate the scenarios in their business and report what is the impact of a specific scenario on their business. We need a similar process here to force. Maybe one way to do it is to say, if you're in the stock market, you have to provide resiliency stress test information in order to stay there, right? There are all sorts of mechanisms that federal government can use to make sure that companies who want to compete and be on the stock market will have to satisfy. What are the specific stress tests? In my opinion, every year it will be different. Every year there will be a set of scenarios that the government will establish and that companies will take their supply chains through and will report. This is the impact of scenario 1, this is the impact of scenario 2. Alternatively, if it does not come from the federal government, I'm hoping that global consulting companies from Accenture to others will take this, will develop a benchmark, and will help their customers to take their supply chains through the benchmark and to report on the performance under various scenarios.
Basically, you are proposing something like resiliency should become part of the something supply Dow Jones Sustainability Index kind of.
Exactly.
So there is next question that amidst this all crisis and talk about supply chain disruption and transactions not happening, Dipanshu asked that will blockchain will had any valuable addition to the overall process of this resiliency part or not?
So I am, there are lots of excitement about blockchain, and I'm not going to be the one to temper that excitement. But I have a lot of doubt exactly what is the value of blockchain in the supply chain. It may be providing some transparency as visibility, but what I am not clear, we already have the technologies that allow companies to have visibility and transparency in the supply chain. Maybe blockchain is very important for supply chain where suppliers are switched very frequently, meaning today you use that supplier and tomorrow you may use a different supplier. So there is no long-term relationship. if there is long-term relationship, you already have the capability to have visibility and transparency in the supply chain. But if the relationship are of short-term, perhaps blockchain can have an impact. It's yet to be seen. But I think if there is, it has to be very specific industries. Think about agriculture, where today you buy from this farmer, but tomorrow you buy from a different farmer. That's where blockchain may have an impact. But in traditional supply chain, where it's all built on collaboration and relationship, uh, I doubt that blockchain will be key immediately. Maybe in the future, because of other capabilities, but today, I think we have a lot of the infrastructure that require for transparency and visibility.
No, so now there are two questions which I will like to club them. There is one by Radhika Gar, another by Jasmine Gujral. So they asked that in this post-COVID situation, does the supply risk has changed, or meaning increased or decreased? The supply chain will look towards supply risk from a different perspective, or the resiliency part of supplier risk will be seen from a different light altogether.
I'm not sure I'm following. Can you read again?
Basically that now, earlier we were seeing suppliers from China and we were not very much bothered about the aspect of it. Now post COVID, do you think that all these companies who are offshoring will look at the supplier risk from a different resiliency aspect also?
Yeah. Oh, I think this is changing the way companies think about their supply chain. I think companies realize that relying on suppliers in China, relying on suppliers in the Far East without understanding the impact on their business can create a huge disruption to their supply chain and to their business. So restructuring is happening, diversifying is happening, and it's not only happening because of the pandemic, it's also happening because of the US-China trade wars that is not going to disappear, in my opinion, in the next few years, even after the election, whatever the election results are going to be.
Okay. Next question is by Vinay Mishra. He asked that, do you think that pooling of inventory for essential services like healthcare is a good idea to mitigate such future challenges?
I think pooling inventory, as I mentioned in one of my slides, let me go to the slide, is a very important strategy to allow us to respond to events like the pandemic. And this is the pooling that I'm referring to here. And in particular, we see this happening for healthcare types of product, PPEs, ventilators, and the like, where the pandemic in different regions show ups and downs, valleys and peaks. And so when the demand for certain healthcare product, like for example gloves, is down in one area, you want to move the inventory to others. That's what pooling allows us to achieve. So I believe pooling is a very important part of the business. Now, you have to be careful. It's not, pooling is not appropriate for every product because it depends on how much volatility you have. The more volatility you have, the more pooling is important.
Okay. Professor, next question is by one of the student, Zulquran Imam. And he asked a very slightly different but unique question in terms of that last similar kind of pandemic though it was of a higher scale, happened in 1919, 1920 as Spanish flu. Okay. And since 100 years has gone by, we do not have much memory of it. So if you think that right now there is a surge in all documentation and research, do you really think that in future we are going to be again forgetting and there will be a memory loss for such kind of event? Or
so I don't have a crystal ball. I think it's a very unique question. But I think we learn from every time there is an event of this type, we learn more. And here, companies learn that just focus on efficiency may be very, very risky for their business. So I'm hoping that we will see a change. I also am hoping that federal government will enforce some changes in critical industries so that this will not happen again. We saw this happening in other after other crises, like the financial crisis. So I'm hopeful that this will also happen following the last 8 months.
Okay, next question is from Omid from Sarif University. And he asked that, can the trade-off between resiliency and cost have an optimum point? And what are the other factors having effect on this optimization?
So the trade-off that I showed, just focusing on resiliency and cost, but companies, of course, have specific business constraints, specific business objectives. When you take this into account, it gives you what is the right balance. For example, a company may focus on maximizing revenue subject to variety of business constraint. And what you want is to take this into account as you identify your strategy. That's why stress tests are so important, because stress test implies that you need to analyze different scenarios, and in different scenarios the impact on performance is going to be differently, and as a result you need to combine the scenarios with a decision-making process. Maybe a different way of saying what I just said. The trade-off curves that I showed is all about science, but this is not just a science. This is a combination of science and art. This is a combination of science and experience, intuition, and domain knowledge. It's bringing them together that allow us to find the right strategy for a company.
Oh, Professor, the next...
Can I suggest, this is a very nice set of questions. If anybody else has other questions, they can send you the question and you can
yeah, so
them to me.
Yeah, what we can do is that we will summarize all the questions and we will send you as a separate document so that you can respond in your free time. Anirban, can you take it from here, please?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Chitresh, for the wonderful Q&A, conducting the question and answer session wonderfully well. And on behalf of and as Dr. Simchi-Levi said, anybody else has a question can send it to me or Chitresh, and we'll compile it and we'll send it across to Professor Simchi-Levi so that he can answer your questions in his free time. And on behalf of the Center of Research in Emerging Economics, I express my profuse thanks to Dr. David Simchi-Levi for agreeing to deliver this talk and delivering a wonderful talk. Like all other audiences, I also learned a lot about something which is very close to my heart, supply chain resiliency, and probably will be able to use some of it for my future research endeavor. I also wish to thank the rest of the members of our research center for the wonderful work that they have put together, not only making this event a success, but making the entire Inspiration series a grand success. And last but definitely not the least, I want to thank the audience for not only for attending it, but for asking some really interesting and thought-provoking questions to Dr. David Simchi-Levi. Thank you, everybody, and good night. Thanks once again, Dr. David Simchi-Levi, for agreeing to deliver the talk. I personally can't thank you enough, and it's been a major pleasure and also a major honor for our research center to have you over.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Okay.
Goodbye.
Thank you so much. Bye. Take care. And
Goodbye.
yep, and I'm going to email you the questions in due time.